My name is Adam Stulberg, and I am the Sam Nunn Professor and Chair of the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology. My areas of specialization are on the geopolitics of energy, on Russia's foreign and security policies, as well as globalization of the nuclear fuel cycle and nuclear non-proliferation. Well, I think that historically speaking, the reference that people tend to use for this crisis is the 1973 oil crisis. And on its face, these are very different scenarios. On the one hand, 1973 was really a marked by the price impact of the disruption. Prices rose almost 400% during that period, as opposed to the current crisis where it's really less about price, although we all feel it and we're talking about prices at over $100 a barrel. The real shock has been to the supply on the supply side, where in 73, when we were talking about 7.5% of the global market was put at risk with this shock. And here we're talking about upwards of 20%. There's a very different distinction between the price and supply shock dimensions of those two crises. In addition, who are the real casualties, right? The developed West, and particularly the United States and our allies in Europe and East Asia, were real casualties and in the 73 crisis. And the immediate casualties of the current scenario are in Asia primarily, with China and India, and of course then Japan and South Korea also taking a hit, with Europe coming in, then the United States and Africa being affected. So on its face, it is very different. When you start peeling the layers of the onion away, you see that there are even more dramatic differences, like the context within which this crisis is emerging is very different, right? This particular crisis has emerged on the heels of already the war, Russia's war in Ukraine, that disrupted gas supplies already, especially to Europe, but also began to have an impact on oil. You also have, with this crisis, the tremendous uncertainty now surrounding the Straits of Hormuz and the accessibility of the straits. Another big difference is that when the 73 crisis hit, there were really no shock absorbers, hence the immediate impact on price. In this crisis, there were shock absorbers primarily developed among consumer states in the wake of the 73 crisis in the 70s across the decades, aimed at providing some buffers, primarily aimed at addressing either short-term perturbations or market perturbations, such as commercial storage facilities, strategic supply stocks and reserves, early warning mechanisms, right? That these things didn't exist in 73. They exist now and are part of the explanation of why the price has not jumped as high as we would have expected. In addition, this particular crisis also had, because especially given the long-term nature and the integrated nature of things, it's having an effect on downstream products, refined products, and petrochemical fertilizers and other things that are then affecting agricultural sectors beyond just those directly impacted by the hydrocarbon shortages. Another impact, and again, this is related to some of the learning that took place after 1973, when we had really the development of an integrated global oil market, and that was augmented by financialization of the oil sector and the development of futures markets. So when we hit the crisis today, those elements are helping to add more ripple effects and complicate the longer term impact of this crisis, because people are buying now for the future and they're making projections based on that. And that has a dramatic impact on how fast you want to arrest the problem, right? Because you're worried about oversupply, and that can then have a longer term effect. So with these integrated markets, the financializations of the markets, the focus on futures, that's added another complicated wrinkle into this current crisis. And of course, the geopolitical fragmentation today is much more conspicuous than that bipolar rivalry that was surrounding the 73 crisis. And then finally, related to maybe the integrated market issue, is you have much more complex logistics surrounding the delivery that are, on one hand, they're more robust, and on the other hand, they're more vulnerable because there are many more opportunities for disruption. In addition, there are the tariffs that are going on at the same time, the emergence of dark fleets that are both cushioning the sector, but also creating some challenges. And then finally, I think one of the real distinctive elements of this particular crisis is that energy infrastructure is actually being targeted as part of the physical military operation. So you see that these crises are very different, not just in terms of their superficial characterization, but some of the deeper elements associated with it. And finally, at the end of the day, the 73 crisis was a very short-term play and arguably had very little impact on geopolitics. It didn't change U.S. policy towards Israel and the Middle East. In fact, we doubled down on that, on the existing Middle East policy at the time. This situation seems to be much more protracted. There's discussion now of a longer term campaign of no war, no peace that raises a lot more uncertainty about access of energy, and so it has economic impact, uncertainty about the U.S. commitment and the reliability of the U.S. to provide protection over the long haul to our regional allies. So there are a lot of differences here. And then finally, I would say that one of the lessons we learned in 73 was the need to diversify sources. And in a context of no war, no peace, in a protracted situation that is compounded, the uncertainties are compounded also by an energy transition. In other words, parts of the world, especially in Europe and in China, they're moving away from hydrocarbons. So the question is, everybody talks about, well, we can build new pipelines circumventing the Straits of Hormuz and, try to avoid concentrating, our reliance on the Middle East. But from a economic perspective, how much does that make sense if you're going to be transitioning away from oil in the mid to long term? So it raises a lot of other complications. I'd just say the one last thing is that, previous oil shocks, including the 73 one, we saw windfall profits going to the producers. In this crisis, actually the producers are, even though the prices are going up, their supplies are being locked in, and so they're not reaping those windfall profits. So there are a lot of differences, and we tend to sort of group all these disruptions together. We tend to confuse commercial from strategic disruptions. We tend to have that bitter feeling of those of us who were around remember the 1970s and the lines, and we don't see lines here, and we wonder where's the impact of this. But it has had impact. Some of the reasons why we haven't seen the immediate impact on price is because of some of those shock absorbers, but we may be reaching the limits of those shock absorbers and entering a new phase. I mean, this is a really good question. I mean, prior to the 60-day pause or alleged 60-day pause, there was real concern that the supply stocks, not just the strategic supplies reserves, but also the commercial supply stocks would really start to dwindle by the end of July. And so, and we were able to avoid really drawing heavily on the strategic reserve, prior to July. So they are being drawn down. We are at the lowest level since 1983. We're not at rock bottom, but the scale of the problem is, if it persists moving forward, is the magnitude is much greater than the supply, the strategic reserve capacity that exists. So we've done a very good job in both the United States and in China in managing these strategic reserves. So we didn't, draw on them immediately. So there's a little bit there, but should we be in this no war, no peace, this on again, off again conflict that then prevents full access to actually presents the positioning of the existing shipping that's there, or getting ships to where they need to be, and then getting them out in time, not to mention restoring some of the damaged infrastructure that is there. I mean, these are, and then replenishing the supply stocks to therefore provide the confidence to the market to handle other perturbations that would hit. I mean, these are, months long processes to build. So even though there may even be an agreement today, the uncertainty that's baked in, and with repeated on again, off again diplomatic dialogues, that is baking uncertainty into the process, the diplomatic uncertainty into the process, such that even when there is an agreement, there may be much more reluctance by insurance companies and other market elements to, be restored. Not mention, getting all of those other infrastructure issues that I mentioned in place. So we're talking already about a protracted situation, probably lasting through the year into the first quarter of next year. But should the diplomatic game and on again, off again, or no peace, no war situation continue for a bit longer, we're really going to start drawing on those supply stocks at a faster rate and just kick down down the pike the recovery time. So it's people are looking at $100 a barrel as some sort of barometer, but it really, if you look at where the price was prior to this conflict, it's going to be it'll be months before we're going to get to that phase, and that's without having any more added uncertainties, such as, again, this no war, no peace, on again, off again, diplomatic warfighting process. There have been some studies that suggest that the average American up to now has incurred about $1,100 burden due to the direct costs on oil and gas, the indirect costs that goes into transportation of foods and services, the impact on inflation when you go to the grocery store, and those things have a disproportionate effect on lower to middle income people. So that's sort of a gross national type of thing. When you look at Georgia, right? Georgia, relies, obviously, we rely a lot on farming, and the impact on the petrochemical sector is raising prices there. There's the direct costs of the fuel that's increasing, not only those costs on the farms, but also transportation. And Georgia is a freight hub for trucking as well as jet fuel. So all of these prices are going to have dramatic effect on Georgians directly, in addition to those broader impacts. Also the impact on the port of Savannah and hauling from that port. So those are sort of more Georgia specific types of costs. But then when you look at this oil crisis in the context of the tariffs, in context of the overhang of the sluggish economy, right? So it's compounding those other factors, which now, when we look at the state budget, we're expecting to see a 1.4 or $1.3 billion shortfall projected in the state revenue budget, which will then have an impact on the state's ability to spend on social programs, on its infrastructure, on education. So again, these costs, the direct and indirect costs of fuel shortages are compounding the tariffs, the impact of the tariffs and the overall sluggishness of the economy to affect consumer buying habits, which are then affecting corporate and state receipts from taxes. And then you add to that the previous decision by the state to not increase tax revenues, but to lower the tax burdens, which on the one hand seems nice, but on the other hand, if you already are incurring $1,100 burden just for the fuel, the energy crisis, and then you have all these other problems added, and lower investments potentially on social programs, on transportation infrastructure, and on education. Well, those are going to have a longer term impact on Georgians. This has been a long-standing issue. The United States, Biden administration, previous administrations, Trump administration have been interested in cutting a nuclear umbrella deal with Saudi Arabia. And so let's make sure we understand what the deal is. The deal is actually not a commercial deal. The deal is a bilateral deal between the United States and Saudi Arabia that sets the parameters that allow companies to then transact with Saudi Arabia. So it puts certain conditions on. And typically and this is part of U.S. law. U.S. law requires these kinds of arrangements in place to allow for companies to transact. And these types of agreements generally put restrictions on the customer state in terms of what they can do in terms of enriching or reprocessing the energy or retransferring any technology that is provided by the United States. Usually they involve some sort of safeguards commitment by the consumer state. So they're aimed at really putting some constraints that meet not just U.S. Economic interests, but also broader national security, non-proliferation considerations, but then sort of act as an umbrella that allow for then the transaction. So the U.S. government has been in a protracted set of discussions with Saudi Arabia over this. And one of the sticking points, well, there've been several of them. One of them is that Saudi Arabia has not wanted to sign on to onerous on-site inspections or challenge inspections beyond the comprehensive safeguards agreements they signed as being a party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they don't want to sign on to the International Atomic Energy Agency's additional protocol that allow for challenge inspections. But also the Biden administration and then now Trump administration had been talking about linking a nuclear umbrella deal to Saudi Arabia's warming of relations with Israel. Okay, and so coming in with the Trump administration, that was sort of where the situation was. Now, of course, this is not occurring in a vacuum because Saudi Arabia is also looking to play off the U.S. against, and Russia and China and even other suppliers and from Asia and Europe, right, to see which bargain they could get. And the added wrinkle for Saudi Arabia in any kind of deal was that they wanted to maintain the flexibility that if Iran ultimately developed a nuclear weapons program, they wanted to be able to follow suit in response. And so that has been a very big sticking point. So now, we have all learned that we're on the cusp of an agreement with Saudi Arabia that somehow transcended some of these issues. And we're told that the administration has been willing to, establish an umbrella agreement and set up a 2-year exploration about whether or not enrichment or reprocessing is warranted, and also to sidestep the inspections issue and the additional protocol issue, the administration seems to be open to establishing some sort of bilateral inspections arrangement with Saudi Arabia. And third, now this is where things get confusing, is that initially we were told that um, Saudi Arabia's warming of relations with Israel was no longer a condition for this agreement, but then Trump seemed to suggest otherwise. So there's some uncertainty about that. And so the question is, why all of a sudden have we moved away from the debates over those other issues to almost seeming progress towards this umbrella arrangement? And, one hand, some people argue that, well, the Israel issue has kind of fallen by the wayside and given the nature of the war that's going on, and also that some of the real, proponents of the linking the Israel condition to the nuclear deal have relaxed their standing, especially in the wake of Lindsey Graham's sudden passing. So there seems to be less political heft, at least within the Republican Party, to push for that conditionality. And with the prolonged conflict with Iran and concerns surrounding U.S. commitment and the vulnerability of Saudi Arabia's infrastructure and questioning of the U.S. military security provided to Saudi Arabia, that the Trump administration may have been interested in providing, this sort of indirect reassurance. Now, that may explain why we're at the conversation of this deal right now, even though there's some ambiguity. And to be fair, we don't know the details of all of these things. And, also to be fair, the public press tends to sort of frame these umbrella deals as all or nothing. They're either, you concede everything to the customer, or you're demanding what's called the gold standard, all of these prohibitions and all of these constraints on the customer, right? And the classic example of the latter is the UAE deal that legally built into the agreement some of the constraints on reprocessing and enriching and retransfers and et cetera. But when you look at the panoply of U.S. umbrella agreements, there's a variety of elements. And it is not uncommon to deal with political conditions outside of the agreement, like in the Vietnam agreement. They call it the silver standard, because Vietnam agreed to some of the terms that UAE agreed to, but did not do it in a legally binding document, did it in a political document. So the fact that Trump may be, raising the Israeli condition at the same time as championing advancement of the legal document, that may, not be unprecedented in doing that. There are a variety of these different types of agreements. I think where the real questions lie, and again, the devil is in the details and we haven't seen them, are what are the terms of this 2-year exploratory period for assessing Saudi Arabia's need for enrichment and reprocessing? What is the criteria? Are we operating on the same criteria? What happens if we disagree? And what are the precedents we're setting by even allowing Saudi Arabia 10 years before it pursues enrichment and reprocessing? Our friends in South Korea may take issue to that because we were very hard on them in terms of their pyroprocessing arrangements. So this may have ripple effects with even our friends and existing arrangements, not only future states. But the other real challenge, I think, and where it seems that the administration may have been playing a little fast and loose, has to do with the safeguards, because it's not clear why they relaxed the safeguards issue, especially reliance on the IAEA's additional protocol that allows challenge inspections. On the one hand, there may be an expeditious reason that as long as the United States is performing those safeguards in a bilateral arrangement with Saudi Arabia, well, maybe we will hold up those high standards. The problem is the precedent that this sets for future deals. Like what would stop Russia or China from saying, "Hey, we've just cut a bilateral deal with Saudi Arabia or another future client state, and we don't need to do the additional protocol or subscribe to advanced safeguards. We're going to handle it bilaterally, just like the United States did." Well, their standards may be very different. Their protocols may be very different. And so this potentially is opening up a big potential problem. And also on the other front, with respect to the enrichment and reprocessing, one of the reasons the Saudis have been reluctant to allow inspectors roam around for these additional inspections is that they don't want to have violations of their religious spaces. But what's to prevent that reason, right, from becoming an obstacle in the bilateral arrangements with Saudi Arabia? So again, the devil's in the details. It's not clear what was agreed to. It's not unprecedented to have different political conditions surrounding legal agreements. But we need much more understanding, especially on the inspections front, as well as on the enrichment and reprocessing arrangements that are in place. But the last thing to keep in mind, and this is where I think there is some confusion, this is an umbrella agreement. This is not a commercial deal. As a result, there's no guarantee, even if you make these concessions and you establish this umbrella, there's no guarantee that the Saudis are going to use American vendors, and this will lead to profits for American companies. They could pocket the concessions, use them in their bargaining with the Russians and the Chinese or others, and then transact with them. So that again, it's not clear what was agreed to, how committed we are or the Saudis are, and what's in it really for American vendors beyond creating a potential opening.